In 1976, a British racer climbed onto a Japanese motorcycle and did something nobody thought possible. He beat the Italians at their own game. The machine he rode changed motorcycle racing forever, ending an 18-year dynasty with technology that was simpler, lighter, and absolutely brutal. By the early 1970s, MV Augusta owned Grand Prix racing. They had won 18 Riders' Championships from 1958 to 1974. Their four-stroke motorcycles were engineering masterpieces, built by hand in Italy with precision that bordered on obsession. Count Domenico Augusta's factory team dominated the 500cc class with machines that cost more than houses. Giacomo Agostini, their star rider, was unstoppable. The bikes produced 85 horsepower from a 498 cubic centimeter three-cylinder engine, revving to 12,500 RPM with 4 valves per cylinder. These weren't just motorcycles, they were rolling proof that Italian craftsmanship ruled the world. Then Suzuki showed up with something different. The RG500 didn't look particularly special. It was square where the Italians were sleek, functional where they were artistic. But hidden inside that aluminum frame was an engine that would rewrite the rulebook. At number 10 on our countdown of what made this machine special, we need to talk about the square 4 configuration. Suzuki arranged 4 cylinders in a 2x2 grid, essentially taking 2 parallel twin engines and squeezing them into one crankcase. The layout was compact, allowing the bike to stay narrow and light. Each pair of cylinders shared a crankshaft, and those crankshafts rotated in opposite directions. This counter-rotation canceled out vibrations that would have shaken the bike apart at high RPM. The configuration traced back to Cold War espionage. In 1961, East German rider Ernst Degner defected to the West during the Swedish Grand Prix, bringing technical secrets from MZ motorcycles. Engineer Walter Cotton had developed rotary disc valve technology and expansion chamber exhaust designs that revolutionized two-stroke performance. Degner handed this knowledge to Suzuki, and they spent the next decade perfecting it. By 1974, when the RG500 prototype called the XR14 hit the track, Suzuki had transformed Cotton's concepts into a weapon. Coming in at number 9, the two-stroke advantage was mathematically brutal. 4-stroke engines like MV Augusta's fire once every 2 crankshaft rotations. They need 4 piston movements to complete a cycle: intake, compression, power, exhaust. 2 strokes fire every single rotation. 1 up, 1 down. Boom. This meant the RG500 produced a power stroke twice as often as the Italian bikes. With 495 cubic centimeters of displacement, the Suzuki could match or exceed the output of much larger 4 strokes. Early versions made 90 horsepower at 11,000 RPM. Later race-tuned models pushed 110 horsepower from the same displacement. MV Augusta's best 4-cylinder bike, developed for 1973 through 1976, made 102 horsepower, but had to rev to 14,000 RPM to get there. The Suzuki delivered comparable power at lower revs with an engine that weighed significantly less. At number 8, weight became the killer advantage. The RG500 tipped the scales at 145 kilograms dry. MV Augusta's 4 strokes came in heavier, burdened by complex valve trains, camshafts, and the robust construction needed to survive high RPM operation. 2 strokes don't need valves. They don't need camshafts or timing chains or rocker arms. Ports in the cylinder walls open and close as the piston moves up and down. Fuel comes in, exhaust goes out, power happens. This simplicity saved weight in places that mattered. Less rotating mass meant faster acceleration. Less overall weight meant better cornering. In racing, lighter always equals faster if you can maintain the power. Number 7 on the countdown takes us inside the induction system. The RG500 used rotary valve induction with 4 28mm Mikuni carburetors, 1 for each cylinder. Traditional 2-strokes use piston port induction, where the piston itself covers and uncovers the intake port. This limits performance because the port timing is tied directly to piston position. Rotary valves, spinning discs with cutouts that align with intake passages, decouple this relationship. Engineers could tune when and how long the intake stayed open independent of piston position. The result was better fuel-air mixing, more complete combustion, and a broader power band. Later models added exhaust port valves, mechanical shutters that altered exhaust timing on the fly. giving riders more low-end torque without sacrificing top-end scream. Moving to number 6, we need to address the cooling system, because this is where things got dangerous. The RG500 used liquid cooling, circulating coolant through jackets around each cylinder. This was critical because 2 strokes run hot. With power strokes happening twice as often, heat builds up fast. The cooling system had to work perfectly, or pistons would expand beyond tolerance, seize in their bores, and lock the rear wheel. This earned the bike its nickname, Whispering Death. At cruise, the RG500 was smooth and quiet, its exhaust note muted compared to screaming 4 strokes. But if the cooling failed, if the jetting was slightly lean, if a rider lugged the engine below 8,000 RPM or over-revved past 10,500, the engine could seize without warning. Riders learned to keep fingers on the clutch lever at all times, ready to pull and disconnect the transmission before a locked rear wheel threw them into a slide. At number 5, the transmission and gearing deserve attention. 6 speeds, close ratio, designed to keep the engine in its power band. 2 strokes are peaky. They make huge power in a narrow RPM range, then flatten out or over-rev into danger. The RG500's power band lived between 9,500 and 11,000 RPM. Outside that window, performance dropped dramatically. The 6-speed gearbox gave riders enough ratios to stay in the sweet spot through corners, down straights, and under acceleration. Gear changes had to be fast and precise. Miss a shift, drop below 9,000 RPM, and you'd lose seconds waiting for the power to come back. Top speed hit 150 to 160 miles per hour, depending on gearing and conditions, but maintaining that speed required constant attention to engine RPM. Number 4 brings us to the democratization of racing. Before the RG500, competitive 500 cc machinery meant factory rides. MV Augusta built their race bikes in small numbers, supported them with factory mechanics, and rarely sold to privateers. If you weren't signed to the team, you weren't riding their bikes. Suzuki took the opposite approach. They designated the RG500 a production racer, building units specifically for sale to private teams. For about $10,000, independent racers could buy a machine capable of winning Grand Prix races. This flooded the grids with competitive bikes. In 1976, RG500s claimed 11 of the top 12 positions in the championship standings. Privateers were suddenly beating factory teams. The playing field leveled not because everyone got worse, but because access to winning technology exploded. Coming in at number 3, chassis design and handling separated the RG500 from its predecessors. Suzuki used an aluminum frame, lighter than steel, but rigid enough to handle the engine's power. The geometry was conventional by racing standards, but refined through testing. Air-assisted front forks allowed adjustment for different tracks and conditions. The rear suspension used Suzuki's full floater system, isolating the shock from direct wheel movement for better traction. Disc brakes front and rear, borrowed from earlier Suzuki models, provided stopping power that drum brakes couldn't match. The complete package created a bike that turned quickly, stayed stable under hard braking, and put power down without excessive wheel spin. Riders could lean harder, brake later, and accelerate earlier out of corners. Lap times dropped across every circuit. At number 2, we have to talk about the man who proved the RG500 could dominate. Barry Sheen was born in 1950 in London's East End. His father Frank raced and wrenched on bikes, and Barry started riding competitively at age 12. By 20, he'd won the British 125cc championship. He joined Suzuki's Grand Prix effort in 1974, debuting the RG500 prototype at the French Grand Prix and finishing second behind MV Augusta's Phil Red. That was the warning shot. In 1975, Sheen crashed at Daytona at 175 miles per hour, fracturing his femur, both forearms, a collarbone, and several ribs. He was back racing within weeks, winning the Dutch TT for his first Grand Prix victory. The man was either insanely tough or completely crazy, probably both. In 1976, Sheen won 5 races in 8 starts, clinching the World Championship with 82 points. He won again in 1977, defending his title against rising American star Kenny Roberts. Sheen's riding style matched the RG500 perfectly. He used the engine's explosive mid-range to outbrake opponents into corners, then hammered the throttle early for devastating exits. Off track, he was a media sensation. He dated models, appeared on television, and allegedly drilled a hole in his helmet so he could smoke between sessions. He made motorcycle racing cool in Britain, drawing massive crowds to Silverstone when the British Grand Prix returned there in 1977. His charisma elevated the sport's profile, just as the RG500 elevated performance standards. And at number 1, the ultimate factor that silenced MV Augusta was brutal economic reality. MV's hand-built 4-strokes cost a fortune to develop and maintain. Each bike required dozens of specialized parts, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Factory support meant flying teams around the world, paying engineers, covering crash damage, and constantly developing new parts to stay competitive. Count Domenico Augusta died in 1971, and without his passion and funding, the racing program struggled. New noise regulations capped exhaust levels at 113 decibels, forcing MV to muffle their engines and lose power, dropping from 102 to 98 horsepower. Meanwhile, Suzuki's 2-strokes got louder and more powerful, selling to privateers who maintained their own bikes and funded their own campaigns. The Japanese manufacturers weren't just building faster motorcycles, they were building sustainable business models. Suzuki could sell 50 RG500s and recoup development costs while flooding grids with their brand. MV built maybe 10 bikes per season, all for their factory team, hemorrhaging money on a shrinking return. After Giacomo Agostini left for Yamaha in 1975, MV's talent pool evaporated. Phil Red won their last championship in 1974, then he left too. In 1976, Agostini gave MV one final victory at a rain-soaked German Grand Prix, but it was a farewell tour. The team withdrew from full-time competition that year, returning only sporadically before disappearing entirely. The technical specifications tell part of the story. The RG500's bore and stroke evolved from 56mm by 50.5mm in early models to 54mm by 54mm in later versions, creating a more balanced, square configuration. This improved mid-range torque while maintaining high RPM power. Compression ratio stayed around 7.5 to 1, typical for 2 strokes running on pump gas mixed with oil. The fuel injection would have been pre-mix, meaning riders or mechanics mixed 2-stroke oil directly into the gasoline at ratios between 20 to 1 and 32 to 1, depending on conditions. This lubricated the engine internals since 2-strokes don't have separate oil systems like 4-strokes. Capacitor discharge ignition provided spark timing, more reliable than old points-based systems and easier to tune for different fuels or altitude. The engine's U configuration placed cylinders in a compact package, but it created cooling challenges. Each cylinder needed adequate coolant flow, and the 2 inner cylinders ran hotter than the outer ones because they sat closer together with less airflow. Radiators had to be oversized to handle the heat load. Riders reported that the bike ran best when coolant temperatures stayed between 60 and 80 degrees Celsius. Too cold, and the engine was sluggish. Too hot, and seizures became likely. Thermostats controlled flow, but track conditions, ambient temperature, and riding style all affected engine temperature. A hot day at a tight circuit with lots of low-speed corners could push coolant temps into the danger zone. Power delivery was anything but smooth. The RG500 made torque in lumps, surging as RPMs climbed through the power band. At 8,000 RPM, the engine felt flat. At 9,500, power started building. By 10,000, it was pulling hard. Hit 10,500, and the engine screamed, delivering maximum horsepower with a sound unlike any 4-stroke. Riders had to modulate the throttle carefully to avoid breaking traction, especially exiting slow corners where rear tire grip was marginal. The expansion chamber exhaust systems tuned these power characteristics, using reflected pressure waves to pack more fuel-air mixture into the cylinders at specific RPM ranges. Change the exhaust design, and you changed where the power came on and how hard it hit. Compared to MV Augusta's 4 strokes, the contrast was stark. The Italian bikes produced power linearly, building smoothly from idle to redline. They felt refined, predictable, almost luxurious in their delivery. You could roll on the throttle, and the bike pulled cleanly without drama. The RG500 was the opposite. It was violent, unpredictable, demanding constant attention. Riders either loved the raw thrill or hated the knife-edge handling. There was no middle ground. But in racing, predictability matters less than outright speed, and the Suzuki had speed in abundance. The impact extended beyond just Suzuki and MV Augusta. Yamaha developed their own two-stroke 500cc machines, first the TZ series, and later the YZR500, that Kenny Roberts rode to 3 consecutive championships from 1978 to 1980. Kawasaki tried with the KR series. Honda eventually returned with their NSR 500 in the 1980s, which dominated the following decade. The entire Grand Prix grid switched to 2 strokes because staying competitive meant adopting the technology. 4 strokes became obsolete overnight. European manufacturers either adapted or disappeared. The shift was total and irreversible, lasting until the early 2000s when 4-stroke MotoGP bikes returned under new regulations, emphasizing environmental concerns. Looking at the championship results shows how quickly dominance shifted. In 1974, Phil Red won the title on an MV Augusta. By 1976, Barry Sheen won on the RG500, and 11 of the top 12 riders used Suzuki machinery. From 1976 through 1982, Suzuki won 7 consecutive manufacturers' championships, even when riders on other brands occasionally took individual titles. The RG500 and its descendants became the baseline that everyone else chased. Private teams could buy competitive equipment, develop it themselves, and challenge factory efforts. This accessibility transformed the sport from a playground for wealthy manufacturers into a meritocracy where clever tuning and brave riding could overcome budget limitations. The street version, called the RG500 Gamma, arrived in 1985 as a homologation special. Suzuki detuned the race engine to 64 horsepower at 8,500 RPM, added lights and turn signals, and sold it to the public. The Gamma was basically a barely street-legal race bike. It weighed 164 kilograms wet, handled like a Grand Prix machine, and scared most riders who tried to ride it hard. Production ran through 1989, with updates keeping it competitive against other two-stroke sport bikes like Yamaha's RZ500. Today, surviving Gammas sell for $13,500 to $33,500 depending on condition, prized by collectors who want to experience the raw edge that defined 1970s racing. The engineering lessons from the RG500 era influenced motorcycle design for decades. Two-stroke technology reached its peak in Grand Prix racing during the 1980s and 1990s, with bikes making over 200 horsepower from 500 cubic centimeters and weighing under 130 kilograms. The power-to-weight ratios were insane, the handling razor-sharp, the performance beyond what seemed physically possible. But emissions regulations and public perception of two strokes as dirty, smoky, and inefficient eventually killed the technology in racing. MotoGP switched to 4-stroke 990cc bikes in 2002, then to 800cc in 2007, and finally to 1000cc in 2012. Modern MotoGP bikes make over 280 horsepower, but they're 4 strokes again, closing the loop back to MV Augusta's original philosophy. The RG500 proved that simplicity beats complexity when performance is the only goal. Fewer parts meant less weight. Fewer systems meant less to break. 2 power strokes per revolution meant more power from less displacement. These advantages were so overwhelming that they rendered decades of 4-stroke development obsolete in a single season. MV Augusta couldn't compete because their entire approach, their manufacturing philosophy, their business model, all assumed that hand-built precision would always beat mass-produced simplicity. They were wrong. The market rewarded accessibility over exclusivity, and Suzuki's production racer strategy demolished the old guard. That's not to say the RG500 was perfect. The seizure risk was real and dangerous. Riders suffered serious injuries from locked rear wheels at speed. Fuel consumption was terrible compared to 4 strokes, limiting range and requiring frequent pit stops in longer races. The power band was so narrow that riders constantly worked the gearbox, clutch, and throttle to stay in the sweet spot. Maintenance was frequent and intensive, with pistons needing replacement every few races and cranks lasting only a season under hard use. The bike rewarded skill and punished mistakes with mechanical failure or crashes. It was a tool for professionals, not a forgiving platform for amateurs. But for those 2 years from 1976 to 1977, Barry Sheen and the Suzuki RG500 dominated Grand Prix racing so completely that they changed the sport forever. They proved Japanese engineering could beat European tradition. They showed that production racers could compete with factory specials. They demonstrated that lighter, simpler, and more powerful was the path forward. Most importantly, they ended MV Augusta's reign through sheer performance advantage. The Italians couldn't match the lap times, couldn't afford the development costs, and couldn't adapt fast enough. The dynasty died not from internal problems alone, but from external pressure delivered by a square 4 two-stroke that hit harder, accelerated faster, and cost less than anything MV could build. So when you see footage of Barry Sheen sliding an RG500 through a corner, throttle pinned, rear tire smoking, helmet tilted back in that characteristic pose, remember what that moment represented. It was the end of an era and the beginning of another. It was tradition falling to innovation. It was proof that racing doesn't care about heritage when speed is on the line. The Suzuki RG500 didn't just beat MV Augusta, it silenced them completely, writing their exit from Grand Prix racing in two-stroke smoke and championship trophies.